Hi, my name is Sarita Bowen, Event Manager with the Justice Action Network, and welcome to episode 3 of Unconventional, a limited series focusing on bipartisan criminal justice reform. This week's episode is focused on driver's license suspension reforms and the effect that it has on our communities. Today, we'll hear from Mike Fonkert of Kansas Appleseed and Alicia Temple from the Oregon Law Center, moderated by Jan's very own Carl Filler. Thank you all for being with us today, and I'll let Carl take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carl Filler with the Justice Action Network. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today to discuss driver's license suspensions. This is still a relatively new area of criminal justice reform. Only 11 states, including Oregon, have eliminated driver's license suspensions for failure to pay so far. However, dozens of other states have introduced legislation over the past several years to stop this practice. I'm excited to be here today with Mike Fonkert from Kansas Appleseed and Alicia Temple from Oregon Law Center to talk through their work on this important issue. I thought maybe we could just start by asking you, and maybe we can start with Alicia, why you decided to tackle this issue in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for having us today. Excited to talk about this topic. We at the Oregon Law Center are a legal aid provider, so primarily do civil legal services. And this was, I think, traditionally thought of as a little outside of what we had worked on in the past, but it started to become really clear that so many clients that came through our doors didn't have driver's licenses, whether they were there for housing or employment help or, whatever it might be. In the conversation, it would come up that they just didn't have a driver's license. And as we dug into that, it became really clear that it wasn't, for safety related reasons. It was for unpaid debt, and it was, criminalization of poverty issues. And so we decided to see if we could do something about it. That was about 3 years ago, so it took some time.
And yeah, Mike, from your perspective, why did you guys decide to tackle this issue?
Yeah, absolutely. And to echo Alicia, thank you for taking time to have us for this conversation today. I think for us, we were hearing from folks in our community, and as we did our work across the state, that this was an issue for a lot of different reasons. And so we undertook some research to gather the numbers in Kansas. And when we got the numbers, it turned out that about 1 in 10 driving age Kansans has a suspended driver's license. So in a state the size of Kansas, we're pretty much a rectangle, 400 by 200 miles. And so that's a lot of ground to cover if you don't have a vehicle. And so we right off the bat really recognized that this was a huge barrier. And then when we dove into those numbers further, about 2/3 of those suspensions are purely for unpaid fines or fees. So this isn't an issue of Kansas drivers being particularly dangerous on the roadway. This is certainly an issue of poverty and the ability to pay. So that's why we got involved, because you need to be able to access transportation in Kansas to be meaningfully involved in work, school, get to the doctor, and this is really important, and so that's why we're doing it.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic to hear, or useful to hear, that both Kansas and Oregon, two different states in different parts of the country, are struggling with some of the same issues, and that this is not a public safety concern. So I'd love to first congratulate you, Alicia, and your colleagues in Oregon for passing HB 4210 in the recent first special session. I know there was some work done over the past several years, including a lot of heavy lifting in the regular session. But how were you able to get this across the finish line? What were the tools and the tricks and the strategies that you found most effective in getting folks to vote for this bill?
Yeah, so it's kind of been a whirlwind year here. I think for so many of us that do advocacy, but in Oregon, folks may or may not know, we had a short regular session this year. So in February, it was typically about a 6-week session. We had this bill teed up and ready to go. The last vote in the Senate was scheduled on a Tuesday. Unfortunately, on that Monday, the Senate Republicans left to deny quorum on totally unrelated issues, but it meant nothing really went through. So we, got out of session without it passing. But knowing we had the votes and knowing it was ready. So when the special session started to come up, I really tried to emphasize what we had already been talking about in February, but obviously about how coronavirus made it so much worse. So I think one thing that was really important was part of February's conversation had been about the racial justice components of this. And Oregon's first special session happened in June, and was one of the priority issues they wanted to look at was racial justice policy changes. And so we had data come out in February from our state police that looked at their citation and stop data. And the superintendent of state police had drawn a straight line from the disparate impact in their data to our bill, and how by ending debt-based driver's license, you would be able to make important changes and improvements in their racial impact. And so we were able to remind people of that this is already an agreed upon racial justice issue. It's a pretty easy bill. It was ready to go. And then emphasize, in COVID, more people are dependent on driver's licenses than ever before. Employment is really dependent on cars and access to driving when we're talking about delivery services and all of that. And in Oregon, these license suspensions were for 20 years. So if you didn't pay, so let's say you lost your job right now, our unemployment system's kind of a mess. So you've been waiting 3 months for unemployment, you get a ticket in your part-time delivery job, and now you can't pay. If that could last and be a barrier for you for the next 20 years, and is a barrier on the state. It costs the state money to be continually pursuing that debt, and it isn't productive. And so it was able to really lean into that, which again, I think we'd been building the case for a couple of years, about with stories of people who had one really hard year in their life, and now 20 years later, they're still trying to dig out from that debt and that spiral. And so I think those messages resonated. And I should not admit this, but I had no idea if it was going to come up or not. I'd kind of thrown my emails out into the wind and had asked. And then the week of the special session, it appeared on the list, and was obviously thrilled to get it done with.
Yeah, that's great. Congratulations. And I know, Mike, this is a priority for you and your organization in the upcoming session. What are you doing between now and then to prepare for this? Do you have any key partners that you're working with? Or
Yeah, so kind of what Alicia alluded to, right? There was a lot of groundwork and a lot of work in previous years to build to that point, and so that's what we're trying to do. We're certainly meeting with key partners. There are some really key legislators that have been on this issue for a long time, and really want to highlight, Senator Faust-Cadeau and Representative Finney are our champions in either chamber here, and there are plenty more too. But those two have really been working on this for some time. And again, Alicia touched on a great point. This is certainly a racial justice issue. When you look at the numbers, there's certainly a disproportionate impact on people of color when you look at suspensions. And so, but yeah, key partners, we're continuing to work with folks that have supported us since day one on this. We work with the ACLU, the Kansas Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, are on our side. And then we've got other partners like AFP, Americans for Prosperity, testified in support of our bill this last session. Some various, there's all sorts of chambers of commerce. But we've got a lot of folks from that community on board too, because it's certainly an economic driver issue. And again, back to Alicia's point, in COVID times, it's even more pressing. We needed to be able to access transportation before, but now we really need our workers that are essential workers, which is a newly grouped category over these last few months, to be able to get to work. And what we see is a lot of what we now deem as our most essential workers are folks that can often be trapped in this debt cycle. So yeah, I definitely call out our legislative champions, our different organizations that we're working with. And what we're doing is we're having meetings, we're continuing to discuss this. get our ducks in a row here during the off season. In Kansas, our legislature runs from January, through May, give or take. But we also had a hard stop with COVID, which we had a couple bills that we were supporting. Didn't end suspensions entirely, but addressed different aspects of the suspension system and would have certainly had positive impact. That had passed the Senate, had passed out of the House committee and was ready to get voted on the House floor, and then it would have got sent to the governor, but everything stopped cold. So we'll have to do that all again, and basically strategizing with our allies about what those bills will look like in 2021. If they're going to look exactly the same, we're going to incorporate them into one, large scale reform bill, or if we'll have several different pieces biting at that apple. But yeah, doing strategy. And then, of course, I don't want to leave out talking to folks that are directly impacted by this. We've been gathering stories from folks over the last year plus. And, there's a ton of situations where it's really heartbreaking that this simple policy has really had such, adverse impacts on folks. And so continuing to gather those stories and really just meet with key folks and get our message out there so that when January comes around, we're ready to have bills introduced, hopefully have a bunch of legislative allies ready to go to bat for this, and we'll get some Kansans back on the road.
That's great. And I don't know, Alicia, I know I watched some of the testimony and the work that you all did in Oregon, and there was a very powerful voice of an affected person who I think, from my perspective, seemed to be very helpful. What I don't want you to, I know it's not necessarily your story, but I don't know if you feel comfortable talking about her or how that was used to sort of persuade some folks who maybe didn't understand the human impact of this policy.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we tried to, as Mike said, have a variety of stories. And I think one thing that became clear as we worked on this is legislators hear from their constituents who are trying to navigate this system. So it often resonated with a legislator when we explained what we were talking about. They're like, oh yeah, I have people ask me how to get their license back all the time, and I don't know what to tell them. And so there are definitely, so many stories out there, but the one that I do think really did make a difference in hearings and in talking to legislators was, it was a woman who actually used to work in the legislature for a senator, and it was her mom. And so it was her story of growing up. Her mom had gotten her first ticket while she was on the way to the hospital because her husband had just been taken away in an ambulance. He ended up passing away, and in that trauma and time of grief, she forgot about the ticket, which I think most of us would. And so she never paid it. And she still today, that was over 20 years ago, she still today doesn't have a license because then she lived in a more rural part of Oregon. There wasn't public transit. She would try not to drive, but she lived somewhere that was really snowy, so she couldn't ride her bike all year round. She had young kids. There's just a never-ending list of reasons why it wasn't possible for her to get by or to work or take care of her family without a car. And so then what you see is the driving while suspended tickets, and how that just becomes this really vicious cycle. And I think she was Angela, who shared her story in the hearings, was a really compelling example of, here's someone who works in the system, in this building, and she's tried to help her mom unravel this, and they can't figure it out. And I think it really personalized it for people, particularly because I think our biggest struggle and opposition was courts saying that they were really flexible with individuals and that they were really lenient, and if someone just came in and explained their circumstances, they were willing to give low payment plans and reinstate licenses. And that's certainly true sometimes, but there are 140 local courts across Oregon, and they all have their own rules and their own systems. And that story was an example of they had tried talking to courts and continually been denied access to good, low, accessible payment plans. And so it really was a tangible example about this kind of vague flexibility promise on the other side.
Yeah, no, these messages and folks are very powerful in convincing some of the legislators. You mentioned local courts, and oftentimes I think we see opposition from some of those folks. They argue that suspension is a tool that they need to ensure compliance and make sure people pay their payments, and it's only fair. I guess, what is the response that you have to them as legislators may either bring that up or hear that as testimony? I don't know, maybe we can start with you, Mike, if you don't mind.
Sure. I mean, I think I'm certainly interested to hear Alicia's answer since they got their bill across the finish line. But no, I think where we go is, first of all, it is not a system that is efficient at collecting. When you look at the amount of uncollected debt, and off the top of my head, I can't recall this, but it's a large number here in Kansas, and it's a large number in most states across the country. And so we like to really point out that other states are doing this now. Other states have ended this practice. The sky has not fallen. They continue to collect debt. I know, there was early reports out after California changed their law that they actually saw an uptick in their recent debt collection. And so, it is an issue that is a bit counterintuitive and takes some discussion with legislators, because, the logic is that payment plans, reducing fines is actually the best way to collect more. And so, yeah, it is certainly a barrier that in folks' minds, at least. But the reality is that this tool is not necessary. We can see those examples in other states. And when we really dive into the numbers, it's not very efficient here. And Alicia already alluded to this. The cost of pursuing that debt for those various jurisdictions, tracking down that number and weighing it against what's collected is a lot of data to sift through. But when you start to look at that, there's not nearly as much benefit as people would like to claim. And there are clearly more effective ways to solicit payment. And just talk about counterintuitive, you're really limiting people's ability to access work and make money to pay their fines when you use this as your coercive mechanism. And so that's really just at the heart of this issue is, we understand that it's baked into so many people's minds that this is a tool that is necessary, but it is absolutely not. We can see that elsewhere. And I'd really like to hear what Alicia has to say on this.
I don't think it's that different than what you just said. One thing that we had to create was what we called our accountability one-pager, which listed all of the different tools that even without license suspension would still exist. So for example, we didn't change the failure to appear suspensions. I think that policy-wise would probably be a good thing to take a look at, because certainly there are poverty reasons why someone can't appear. But for this time, we didn't change that. So, people still have to show up to court. They have to contact the court. They have to be in communication. And what we really heard from judges was they felt like this was the only way they got people's attention. And so, by failure to appear suspensions, they still had that option. They had payment plans. They send people to collections. They use tax offsets. So they collect through people's tax refunds. So if somebody has money, there is a mechanism to get it. If they don't have money, you're not going to get money from them, but also suspending the license isn't going to make money appear either. And so I found that accountability one-pager to be one of our best, just like practical tools. We also, told people that if someone is truly willfully defying the court, I think there's this kind of hypothetical person in so many people's mind, right? The millionaire who just racks up tickets and doesn't care and is going to be a safety concern. Both Oregon has mechanisms where if you get a certain number of tickets, regardless of if you've paid them or not, your license is suspended. So I think it's 3 tickets in 18 months or 4 tickets or 24 months. So safety wise, we could just kind of try to take that off the table right away. And then if someone's being really willful, there is contempt proceedings. We don't like it, we don't encourage it, but through contempt, you could suspend a license. And we spend a lot of time on that legal question. Could you use contempt just to suspend a license? And they decided, yes, you could. So again, we don't want to see more of that. We don't encourage it. But for that kind of mythical millionaire who just doesn't care about courts, there are tools. And then that California data was really, I think, pretty life-changing for our process, because it did, I think was a really concrete example. We had courts telling us all sorts of numbers, anywhere from they would lose 10% to one court said 90% of their revenue would be lost. That court suspends 3 times the number of licenses that they have residents in their county. So there's something to be done there. But that data really showed us, like, it maybe doesn't concrete show what's going to happen in the long term. They don't draw a straight line from these policy changes to this increased revenue in that year. But if courts lost 50% of their revenue or 90% of their revenue, certainly that would have shown up in that first year of data. So that was I think, really useful tool. It didn't stop revenue being a concern. That I think that was our hardest issue to get over, was the Legislative Revenue Office did say the state would lose a decent amount of money through this, and we weren't able to convince them that they were wrong. I believe they were wrong, but technically it had that statement. And so we had to just convince legislators, this data shows our state economists aren't really taking everything into account when they create these statements.
Yeah, and I know now, you both have mentioned money, which is at the core of a lot of these things. And I feel remiss not to mention that, we're living in COVID-19 pandemic, and money is obviously what everyone's talking about as state budgets are hit really hard. Has that impacted? I know for Oregon, it was sort of in the middle of that first period. And I know for Kansas, this will be talked about, in that sort of second period. But has that changed how you've approached messaging or anything else? Or is this just an easier sell now that, people are struggling to keep and find jobs?
I can start. Yeah, so I think the point you just landed there at the end, Carl, I think more than ever, it's important that people are able to access work, and obviously school and the doctor and all that. But to a point Alicia was touching on about the projected revenues, I think, the reality there is it is going to be hard to convince folks that they're wrong, but you cannot underestimate the economic benefit of all of these folks being able to be on the roadway legally, safely, and able to access the economy in meaningful ways. So while there's certainly some budget implication there, I think it's at least really clear to us that this is a budget winner long term, because when Kansans are able to access the economy effectively, that's going to be more people working, more people spending money, and more people making money and paying those taxes that are associated with every step of that process. So while there may be this hit at this accounting level, over the long term, I think this is certainly a budget winner, and making that case I think is really important. I just wanted to circle back. We're also working on a one-pager. We didn't call it the accountability one-pager, but we might now. So I'm very interested, Alicia, in talking about that further offline here. And yeah, I think that's something that we encountered last session, and it's something we've been working on. So good to hear that we're on the right track at least.
I would be happy to share it with you.
Yes.
If you want to see it. It was like legislative meeting after meeting. Our partners and I were like, this is the question everyone has, and no matter how many times we told them, it felt like it didn't always, it was still the concern. And I do, I understand it. And I think we always had to make it clear, like, we're not arguing that people shouldn't pay. That's
Right.
not what this conversation is. We're not taking away the debt. We're not saying there shouldn't be consequences for driving. What we're saying is this is an ineffective tool that is causing harm. And I think, Mike, to your question, payment plans is really where, or not to your question, to your point earlier, like payment plans is where the conversation should go if legislators and courts are concerned about revenue. I think what data is starting to show us is there are plenty of places where by changing your payment plan system, you get more money. People are able to pay $50 or $100 over the course of a few months a year in low increments. But if they owe $500 and they're told it's all or nothing, that's just daunting. They're just not able to do that, and they're not going to do that. And they just, I think data shows that. We see that in our experience with people who want to make it right and be right with the system, but just don't really know how. And so whenever that revenue conversation came up, I tried to remind people or kind of pivot to payment plans is really where we should be putting our policy energy if what you want is to fix the revenue concerns here. Fortunately, we have a state senator who was really instrumental in getting a lot of this passed, who also had a past experience with a city in his district who was using traffic citations as a very clear revenue generator. And it was kind of a well-known speed trap that was funding their budget. And so there was some, I think, history of messaging there that, like, we can talk about the revenue conversation, but we should never be tying that to courts' budgets, although I think practically, of course, it is, but that justice and budgets should not be in the same conversation. We should have a conversation about what is the right thing to do that is about public safety and about not causing harm, as opposed to how are we funding our courts, and those are different.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I think, as we go into the last question here, I think hopefully folks take away that as a useful messaging process. So for those other states and organizations that are looking to tackle this type of legislation, do you have any suggestions beyond what you've already talked about? Mike, yeah, we can start with you.
I'll start again. So beyond what we've talked about, not a ton of suggestions, but I think what I would say is, if you are in a state where this hasn't been an issue that's been elevated, I would certainly recommend looking into it, because I think this is a problem in every state, in one way or another. And so, start exploring the issue and start talking to folks. And I think once you start that process, you will be flush with stories that continue to fuel your desire to change this policy. And so what you'll also find is this is, not only is this a budget winner, in my opinion, this is a bipartisan winner. We've got strong allies on both sides of the aisle, and that's always an exciting thing, particularly in the times that we live in now, to really be part of a movement that is bringing people together. And so, I think this is a winning issue, and I would encourage everybody to check it out in their own states.
Anything more to that, Alicia? Sorry.
I mean, I would echo that absolutely it is a bipartisan issue, and I think, within criminal justice reform and racial justice issues, that can be tricky conversations these days. And so this always felt like a good one to move in those conversations. I would say, we were talking a lot about revenue, but I really do like getting clear on how your cities and counties are going to talk about their revenue loss in addition to the state, so that you can kind of figure out early on how you're going to tackle that and what to expect, and being able to find a few cities and or counties that are supportive of the bill. That made a big difference, I think, for us, because there was a decent amount of opposition from cities and counties on behalf of their courts, their local courts. a thing we did that I think really did pay off in the end, but was a lot of work, was a public records request of every municipal and justice court in the state to ask for what their payment plans looked like, so that then when, because that was so much of the conversation of, we do payment plans, look at all these options, we could say, well, actually, this percent of courts don't have written payment plans. There's no information on the website, or this payment plan requires you pay off your total debt in 4 months, or whatever it is. And so being able to really point to those concrete examples throughout, I think, was useful. It is a lot of work on the front end, so judge that as you may, but I think that was a useful tool going through it.
Well, thank you both. I guess the only last question I have is, what's next? What are you going to do, Alicia, now that you've passed this legislation?
That's a really daunting question to me, to be totally honest. We've talked a lot about payment plans today, and I do think, that's where we need to spend some attention, is requiring payment plans, allowing low minimums, and really setting a standard across our court systems. So that's, I've been saying to legislators and our champions that stopping the harm of license suspension has always been the first step. Like, we have to stop this harm while we look at the system overall. Now we're at the look overall part, and it's a pandemic and there's a lot of things going on. So figuring that out, but I think payment plans for now is the tangible goal.
Mike, I know obviously the bill itself is big for our next
That's
step.
right.
Anything beyond that you're thinking about right now?
On this issue, I think, getting our bill reintroduced and really solidifying our allies. And then beyond that, I love, and we talked about this some last year, incorporating into this reform, potentially on the front end, something that emphasizes payment plans, because there's a lot more that comes after, as Alicia said, ending the harm of this practice. And then of course, as we touched on early in this, failure to appear suspensions are something that certainly warrant a deeper look. But yeah, right now we're focused on getting the bill back and pushing it all the way to the end this year, hopefully, and then we'll really start to push forward on other stuff.
Well, thank you both, Mike and Alicia. This has been fantastic to hear about your work. We hope other states and organizations will benefit from your experience and your stories you shared today, and look forward to watching the good work you do next legislative cycle.
Thanks, and good luck, Mike.
Hey, thank you, and congratulations, Alicia.
Thank you. Thanks.